Our first speaker is Shams Rehman, who has extensively researched the political transnationalism of the British Kashmir diaspora. He has played a central role in setting up transnational TV channels in Britain with a special focus on Kashmir and Kashmiris across the globe. He authored Azad Kashmiris and British Kashmiri Diaspora in 2011, and he has been building another mediascape for British Kashmiris. So we have Shams Rehman for the first talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Goldie, and thank you for the organizers to giving us this opportunity to listen to so many insightful contributions today. And if I use that, most of what is said about the history and political struggles in Kashmir as the backdrop, then one problem with the existing scholarship and existing political narratives on, about Kashmir is that it is usually, when it is seen through the eyes of colonial and Indian Pakistani perspectives, it reduces its relevance with the wider state of Kashmir, and the concept of that united independent Kashmir obviously becomes less relevant. But when you one of the another problem with that is that it also obscures the political processes and state formation and nation building processes that were going on in the state of Kashmir before invasion of Pakistan and then India and then its division. It seems like that this was a despotic ruler there, and then people were just as passive subjects, and then that ruler had a right to decide, and he decided or not decided, and as a consequence, we are in the situation which we are in. But if we look at closely in the history of that period before division, particularly after 1930s, there was, in this particular state, in comparison to other princely states, there was very advanced political movement for democratization of the system. And obviously there were some forces to replace it, some were to reform it. But there was a very mature, very popular process going on there. So if we look at the situation from independence politics perspective, that is my focus here, that how the independence politics existed before the division and what happened to it after the division. If we look at the situation before the division, I have traced that till 19th of July 1947, there were three major political parties functioning in the state. Muslim Conference, the first party that was formed in 1932 out of a popular movement that was mainly mobilized around the Muslim identity and consisted and led mainly by Muslims, but not only by Muslims. And then this party's name was changed to National Conference in 1939 after very consistent debates and discussions within the party and outside. And the third party was formed in 1946, Mazdoor Kisan Conference. And if we look at the situation about the future of Kashmir at that stage, before July 47, there was no mention of accession to India or Pakistan by any of the political parties or by the Maharaja government. So all political forces and Maharaja government, they were for there was contestation, but it was to reform a state according to their own perspectives. So I have traced 4 perspectives of independent Kashmir before the division. The first we can describe as an official national perspective. The second was a popular national perspective. And third, religious national perspective, I would call it. And fourth one was the progressive national perspective. And then I will talk about what happened to these perspectives after the division, giving brief points about their defining achievements and their nature. The official perspective was led by Maharaja Hari Singh. It seemed it was rooted mainly in the interests of government elites comprising primarily of Maharaja family, his Dogra clan, and the wider Raja Baradari that also included Muslim, mainly of Jammu, with some inclusion of Pandits of the valley. I mean, we are used to see that Maharaja was represented only Hindus and the popular movement was of Muslim. I don't think it was that simple. Regionally, the epicenter of this perspective was the Jammu city, but had support in most of the government departments and officers across the state. The most prominent feature of this perspective and contribution in state and nation building process was the state subject legislation that defined the citizenship of the Kashmiris of the state. The national identity shaped by this perspective was the Riyasti, or state identity, with Kashmiri as the most prominent and at times defining component of the political identity of the state. Then the national popular perspective, which can also be seen as kind of national perspective from below. This was led by Sheikh Abdullah in National Conference. The epicenter of this perspective can be traced down to the Muslims of Srinagar and Jammu, but it spread across the state over the years into various regional, religious, linguistic, and class formations or social groupings and identities through the popular politics that gripped the entire state at that juncture of Kashmiri history. The defining feature of this perspective was the New Kashmir Manifesto that, incorporating the state subject, provided grounds for the modern politics and governance in Kashmir state. The national identity here was clearly the Kashmiri identity, but not as a linguistic or cultural identity confined to the Kashmir Valley, but a political national identity rooted in the state subject, encompassing all regions, religions, and languages of the state, which was clearly manifested in the New Kashmir. And the religious perspective, or is usually described today as Islamist perspective, was initially the driving force for political mobilization, but was later found unable to incorporate the non-Muslim population of the state and replaced with National Conference. It regained significance when some of the Jammu Muslim leaders left National Conference and reformed the All Jammu Kashmir Muslim Conference in 1942. Now its epicenter shifted to Jammu Muslim. The defining achievement of this perspective for the distinct identity of the state and nation building process can be seen as the resolution for independent Kashmir on 18th July 1947. It was in opposition to this resolution that the minority of members of the party who opposed the resolution passed the accession resolution on the next day. Then we can trace the socialist perspective or progressive national perspective. It can be seen and described as the offshoot of national perspective and was emerged out of the disappointment with what the proponent of this perspective called the failure of National Conference in delivering on its promises and the authoritarian and undemocratic style of the leadership of National Conference leader Sheikh Abdullah, who at this point was too powerful to be challenged from within the party. The epicenter of this perspective was in the left intellectual circle of Srinagar, led by Premnath Bazaz, and radical peasants of valley rural areas led by Abdul Salam Yatu. The most prominent achievement of this perspective had been the notion of Azad Kashmir that was coined during its convention on 12th May 1946 in Kabamarg village of Anantnag. Now, if we look at what happened to these four forms of politics or four forms of independence perspectives, we see that official and progressive perspective, they both were disintegrated with the division of Kashmir. Because Maharaja system was collapsed and he was replaced by a national conference, and the Mazdoor Kisan conference, their cadre was dispersed. Some fled to Kashmir side, Azad Kashmir side, and others stayed there, and the party was never reformed. After that, the National Conference, which obviously was the largest party at that time, they gave up their goal of independence and they replaced it with the autonomy. The Islamists or pro-Pakistan and secular voices in this new setup became seditious, anti-national and illegal in the Indian-occupied side of Kashmir. However, within few years, Sheikh Abdullah, the Prime Minister, was deposed, followed by constant breach of constitutional provisions regarding accession and autonomy. And to counter that, Sheikh Abdullah formed Plebiscite Front as a side organization, but this organization can also be seen as the first organization in the divided Kashmir asking for independence. This organization was also replicated in Azad Kashmir, where the proponents of religious national perspective were installed to the government by Pakistan with similar outcomes and almost similar results. Here too, Sardar Ibrahim, the host of 19th July 1947 accession to Pakistan resolution, was deposed, and protests in his home region of Poonch were brutally crushed. It was from this plebiscite front that National Liberation Front was born in 1966 in Peshawar, Pakistan, and Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front in 1976 in Birmingham, Britain. The focus of this thread of independence activism in AJK and diaspora remains the Indian occupation across the division line, with the exception of Gilgit-Baltistan week in 1970s. Overall, there is silence about the Pakistani occupation. That is seen as the speciality of another form of independence politics. Challenging the Pakistani occupation was came from another political development in Azad Kashmir. This was a student organization called National Student Federation, formed in early 1960s. Because their struggle has always been peaceful and there were no major clashes with the Pakistani state, or there was no violence of a larger scale, therefore, they are little noticed by the people who work on Kashmir issue and Kashmiri people. Okay. Their focus from very beginning has been on the Pakistani occupation with strongest socialist and secular rhetoric. The NSF activists were later instrumental in the formation of Bhutto's PPP in 1970s, British returned Barrister Qurban's Jammu Kashmir People National Party, and staunch socialist trade unionist Sardar Anwar Khan's Jammu Kashmir National Awami Party. In comparison to the national liberation activism of NLF led by Maqbool Bhat and later JKLF, the NSF tradition of civil and pressure politics remains less noticed beyond the confines of Azad Kashmir and Pakistani left circles. However, Pakistani authorities came down on NLF after Ganga hijacking in the 70s. The NSF played a leading role in organizing protests in support of Kashmiri prisoners and for their release. It is argued by many activists that the intensity and scale of protest produced by the convergence of these two traditions of indie politics in Azad Kashmir at the execution of Maqbool Bhat on 11 February 1984 alerted Pakistani authorities to the growth of independence politics in AJK and diaspora that was no longer focused on the Indian occupation only. At this juncture, the resistance politics in the Indian occupied Kashmir, especially in the valley, was reached to a clashing point. While I'm not the best qualified to offer a comprehensive analysis of the evolution of anti-India and pro-freedom politics in the Indian occupied Kashmir, however, it appears from whatever I could gather that resistance movement on that side has been driven by the Islamic ideology and deliberate and a show of love for Pakistan. There, the forces excluded by the National Conference and the wider Indian installed and backed setup initially were represented by Jamaat Islami and Islamic Student League. At this stage, however, the militant activity on that side was not a priority, with the exception of Azam Inqilabi's Operation Balakot and hijacking attempts. The major resistance forces in IOK were fighting with whatever space was available for peaceful, democratic, and civil politics. The resistance politics there reached to its peak in 1987 in the Muslim United Front. They were ousted from this space through open and brutal rigging of elections, and crackdowns on protesters appeared as the point where trust in democracy was replaced by the hope in militancy. At this point, the JKLF formed in Birmingham 1976 and exported to Pakistan in Azad Kashmir in 1984 and 5 was used as channel to connect the valley resistance against Indian occupation with the JKLF tradition of activism. This was a transnational political space for anti-Indian occupation. That's how it was created. Okay. At present, there is interesting development in diaspora that can strengthen or weaken the independent Kashmir politics depending on the approaches and strategies of leadership in the coming years. While previously JKLF was the only organization in diaspora, now we have all other organizations, pro-independence organizations operating in Britain and in Europe as well. And another interesting development is the growth of more realistic understanding amongst many surviving Kashmiris from the valley about the role and interest of different stakeholders in Pakistani civil and military establishment in relation to Kashmir. The increased interaction between Kashmiris from both sides, especially on the social media, is also an encouraging development, which of course will have far-reaching effects, but that is all I have for now. Thank you.
The next speaker is Fahad Shah. Fahad, find your biography. Is a journalist and writer. He's the founder and editor of the Kashmir Wala. His latest book is Of Occupation and Resistance, an anthology that focuses on resistance and politics in Kashmir. So I'll turn it to Fahad.
Thank you all for coming here. I don't have any paper because I don't write for these things. I just speak my mind out because I'm a storyteller, so I just tell stories. I have to speak on journalism and activism. Well, I'll start with this, that the journalism in Kashmir has gone through different phases. There was a phase in Kashmir before 1990s when most of these spaces where you tell the stories were taken up by the people who are not Kashmiri, people like MJ Akbar or others from India or somewhere else, and that was good, of course. But we had little representation of our own in Kashmir, and there were not much books written by Kashmiris. There were not much of the spaces started by Kashmiris. But after the 90s, what happened that when the violence started happening with the late 80s militancy, the people in Kashmir joined fields like journalism and activism and other such fields, and they started telling their own story. But still, we had a little representation at the global level where people would discuss Kashmir. So the first, we can say, the shell was broken by Basharat Peer when he wrote the book Curfew Night, which is a brilliant book. And then, since then, we had several books. Mirza Waheed wrote a brilliant book, The Collaborator. Then we had Until My Freedom Has Come. Then Siddharth Gigu wrote a book, The Garden of Solitude. Now Natasha's book is out, and my book also is part of that. And so this whole process has been going on for years and for decades, and I'm the product of that process. And I'm from the generation which hasn't seen Kashmir when there was no military, or when there was not such repression as it is right now. Because I'm born, there's a generation in Kashmir which is changing the things in Kashmir right now, as a lot of speakers mentioned about self-representation and Facebook spaces and other such spaces like websites and other things. And this is the generation which is taking up these spaces and trying to tell their own story in a different way. And most of this generation is taking part in journalism, in fields like art, literature, in painting, and in cartoons, like Anand mentioned a lot of it. But in Kashmir, it's not easy to be a journalist in a place like Kashmir where things are not black and white. It's always gray. You don't have one truth in Kashmir. We have a saying within our friends which we say mostly, that in Kashmir the biggest tragedy is truth, because you don't know what is that one truth, because there is no such truth which you have to say. And mostly we get told by people from India or from outside India that, oh, it's easy for people in Kashmir to become journalists and to choose these big fields and to get scholarships and to be at these platforms to speak. But I must tell you, it's not that easy, because it comes with a price which you pay through your whole life, the way you live in that situation. Because as I guess Mirza said, that in Kashmir, there's nothing you can stay away from politics. When you're born and when you get into your senses, you know things, everything is politics. Even if you go to a bread maker or you go to a shop, whatever you are discussing is politics. There's no such place, I think, in a day where someone or the other will not mention Sheikh Abdullah, because it's the part and parcel of the society. Everyone says, either someone will say good about Sheikh Abdullah or someone will say bad about Sheikh Abdullah, that he did a big mistake. But I'm just saying that it's a process. Like with my life, the first thing I remember about Kashmir conflict is 1996 elections, like how forces came into our houses and then forced people to vote. And it was not that I wanted to be a journalist since day one. It was not like that. But then when you see the whole process, that how things are happening around you, that how you're being reported, that how Praveen Swami writes in The Hindu about you, how he says that Sopore had a good elections when there was like just a few dozen of people who voted. So you have to go and choose this space and choose these fields and take up these platforms and speak for yourself. So I believe in speaking for myself. I don't think that I need someone else to speak for myself. Of course, there should be debate between the people and exchange of ideas all over the world, but then we should have a say in whatever is happening. So I quoted Praveen Swami because last month he did a story in The Hindu where he mostly writes, and he quotes most of the times. He has these brilliant sources from intelligence on which he crafts the stories. And in his story, he concluded that the people of Sopore, mostly the young, are drug addicts, and the separatists pay them around 100 rupee to throw stones. And that's how the election boycott was possible in Sopore. But he never said who was the person who is taking the drugs, and who are these people, how did he get to know. And this is like the big newspaper in India which is reporting about Kashmir and trying to portray that the boycott in Kashmir was nothing. It was just some of the, which they say, as I quote, misguided people who were forcing the boycott on people. Like if I ask people here that how many of you know that what was the intensity of the election boycott in Kashmir, I'm sure most of the people won't know, because the media never reported it in that way. It should have been. Otherwise, it was in 2 districts, it was less than 30% voting. In Baramulla, it was around 40 or something. But this is why journalism by people of Kashmir is so important, and this has been inspiration for me also. Like people like Basharat and Mirza, and when they started doing these things, then we thought, oh, we should do the same thing. And now this same space is changing into a different direction, because as you know, since 2008, the things started changing in Kashmir. Till 2008, it was mostly about the gun. It was mostly about the people had picked guns in late 80s, and there was a movement, armored movement. But in 2008, these young people started throwing stones. They started writing on social media. They started making videos, and they started this debate and conversation with the world outside Kashmir. And after 2008, 2009, and 2010, the mass protests happened again, and this whole narrative of new resistance, which we call in Kashmir, got established. And we call the another narrative which got established in Kashmir was art revolution, because the young people started taking these new spaces and mostly the creative fields to tell the same thing which the people with the guns were telling, but this was a more peaceful and a more creative way. But what happened with that is, this is the most contemporary situation I'm talking about right now, that this didn't go well with the state, of course. So in last 5 years, there have been several number of youth who have been using Facebook, and they have been arrested. There are examples like Faraz Yassin, Waqar Muhammad, and Waqar Moharkant, and other people who have been in jail for months for just posting something on Facebook. And in this year also, there have been some arrests because of using Facebook and Twitter. And then the other thing which happened in Kashmir lately was this alternative media which started coming up, because in Kashmir we have a large media organizations. We have around it's in hundreds there are newspapers registered in Kashmir. But there's another thing happening in Kashmir is that the armored movement, when it started, so how did the Indian state respond to the armored movement? They created the counterinsurgents, they created Ikhwan, they divided people within Kashmir. And with this new resistance, the same thing is happening now, and it has been happening for a few years now, that they are creating their own versions of new resistance. If there is a singer singing a resistance song, there's another singer who is singing something else. If there are websites, there are blogs, there are things, there are magazines, alternative magazines on Kashmir which are talking about the human rights violations and the resistance. On the same level, parallel, there are other versions of the same thing. So what they are doing, they're diluting the discourse which this certain group is trying to develop in the world. And with the newspapers, I won't go much detail into that. We spoke that last time at Warwick, that how newspapers function in Kashmir. Everybody knows that the media has their pulls and pressures, we know that, but still they try to find a way and they try to work. But as in India, mostly people in Kashmir, they don't look up to the Indian media because they have seen how the Indian media has been covering Kashmir. So in Indian media is getting more and more towards corporatization. As you know, recently Reliance took over one of the major media organizations, Network 18. They took the management control. I'll quote one example, which I did last time also, that there was this one Kashmiri student in Delhi. His name was Imran Kirmani, and he was doing a pilot training in Delhi. And after he finished pilot training, he got a job in one of the airlines, private airlines in Delhi. And he had just few days to join the company, and there were 5-6 civilian people who came to his house, to his flat, and they told him that you have to come with me, you have to come with us, you have to assist us in some investigation. So he said, but what is this about? I don't know anything. They said, it's okay, you should not call your home, it's okay, we'll let you go in few hours. And he went with them, and then they kept him for 3 days. And so the people who came to his house were from the Lodi Road police station in Delhi, which is one of the notorious police stations in Delhi, which is accused of several fake encounters in Delhi and fake arrests. So they arrested him. For 3 days he was in that police station, and he didn't know what was happening with him. They were telling him that it's all okay, it's all fine, you don't need to worry. And then this is what he is telling me after he came back to Kashmir, and just 2 years ago, at his home in Handwara, which is one of the northern districts in Kashmir. So he says that then after 3 days, they told me that you should take a shower and you should come with us, we are going somewhere. And then I said, okay. So I went and I changed, and they came with me, and suddenly they opened a door, and what I saw was all the cameramen and the reporters there clicking pictures. And there were policemen with me, and they told the media that this is the guy we have arrested. He's an LET militant, and he was planning a 9/11 type attacks on Diwali in Delhi. So then he was arrested. So for 5 years, he was in jail, and five years, his trial was going on and on in court. And then after 5 years, the court says that there is nothing against him, is not involved in anything, there's no evidence against him, and after 5 years, he gets acquitted by the court. And the point here is that when I went to his home after 5 years, after he was released and he was at home, so I talked to him. So I, myself as a journalist, like journalists are told doubt everything. Whenever you go to report, you should doubt every version and you should recheck it. So I thought maybe he's getting too much emotional or something. I should check what happened 5 years ago. So I went back to the stories 5 years ago when he was arrested, and that's exactly what I found, what he told me. So I found all the major newspapers and news magazines and the news channels of India reporting him as a LET terrorist, without any trial, he was not proven being a terrorist, but they were reporting LET terrorist held in Kashmir, we recovered this much of money, this much of ammunition, which was all false. And then he told me at his home that I will never, and he never talked to any Indian media after that. And after that, he never went to India, because that's what changed him. And then he was asking questions like, what should I do with my life now? My 5 years are ruined, and this is how media played with my life. This is how they reported me. And this is just one incident I'm mentioning. There are several such incidents which has happened. That there is this thing in India which is called media trial. You will see that the person is getting arrested, and you will see in the media they give judgments like, oh, he's a terrorist, he's this and he's that. So this whole thing which media creates is the perception among the people in India. I myself don't blame the people of India for a lot of things, because they have to question, but there is a lot happening because of the media, because the media is telling them this is how they behave. Like in Delhi, some people ask me, oh, is everybody in Kashmir carrying a gun? They think it's like Afghanistan. They think they have this notion in mind that this is how it is. That's how the media creates it. And in India, I think the majority of the people watch Doordarshan. And if you will go and watch Doordarshan, you will see what kind of programs they have. They have like a Pakistan reporter, Kashmir this. These are the kind of everything that they do is propaganda. So all the things come together and then form this narrative in us that we should do something on our own. And that's how these new books are coming up. There is a new book coming this year by Shahnaz Bashir, The Half Mother. There are a lot of writers right now in Kashmir. There are a lot of new people who want to become journalists, and there are a lot of people who are writing, who are producing every kind of art they can do to keep this movement alive, to keep this self-representation and storytelling alive in this new form. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sanaah Sultan. Sanaah is a British Kashmiri student activist and a spoken word poet. She studies medicine at the London School of Medicine and Dentistry, and I think many of us know Sanaah as someone who's completely dedicated and committed in terms of spoken word and in terms of her activism, and I think we're going to get to hear some of her spoken word.
So I haven't really planned what to say today, but you wanted to ask me to come and speak about activism with regards to Kashmir, and I think the only logical answer to that is what activism, especially here in the UK. As British diaspora of Kashmir, I don't think there is very much activism actually occurring. And for me, as a young Kashmiri of a similar generation to Fahad, and understanding what is happening in Kashmir today, which I'm sure all of you have understood having listened to everybody else who's spoken, it's very difficult to come to terms with the idea that there is actually very little being done here. And also, there's the fact that Britain has the largest diasporic population of Kashmiris in the world. And when it comes to student activism, there are only two student societies for Kashmir in the country. One is in Birmingham and one is in Edinburgh. And again, that kind of begs the question, why? And I think to some degree, that's because there's a huge generation gap. I think you can see on the panel today, there's kind of two young people and two slightly older people. I don't want to offend anybody. And that kind of reflects the problem that we have. A lot of young people in Kashmir, young people from Kashmir here in the UK who were born and raised here, have very little understanding of what's going on at home. And I think I'm going to speak kind of mainly regarding the Azad Kashmiri community, because many of us aren't told about what it means to be Kashmiri or what's happening at home. And I think in that aspect of things, I was lucky, because when I grew up, my father told me about Kashmir. He told me what was happening in Kashmir. He told me that I'm Kashmiri and not Pakistani. He very clearly made that distinction. So growing up, I understood that. And so when I have friends who, I tell them I'm from Kashmir, and they're like, so where's that? So then I explain I'm from Kashmir, it's occupied by 3 countries, Pakistan, India, China, and you know the spiel. I tell them this, and they ask me, ask a few questions, and you explain. And then you ask them, where are you from? And many of them answer Mirpur. And they answer Pakistan, and you ask, where in Pakistan? And they say Mirpur, and I feel like, everything I've just said was redundant. Because, is Mirpur not a part of Kashmir? And I think that kind of lack of understanding of, the idea of Kashmir as a whole, including Azad Kashmir and the Valley and the Gilgit-Baltistan, is problematic in many ways. And because of that, because we don't understand where we're from, nobody talks about it. And that explains why young people here who are Kashmiri aren't talking about Kashmir. And it's great to see that there are people here today who are from Kashmir, or not even from Kashmir, but they're here because they care, and I hope that in some way today has informed them a little bit more, and maybe they'll want to go and do something. And then there's kind of the question of what should we do? And, well, there's a lot of problems in Kashmir. Where do we start? What part of Kashmir do we start in? Who do we talk to? And again, there's kind of a huge vacuum, which way do we go? Who do we start with? And I think there's kind of a process that you go through if you're trying to find out about Kashmir. And then you again come to a place where you realize, well, really there's not a lot going on. And what is going on, I find that, again, it comes back to a generation gap. A lot of the things which are being done by people who are a lot older than us. And the ways in which they are being done, we don't really understand. And we don't really identify ourselves with their methods, or to some degrees even the ideologies that they have, because things have changed. And Kashmiris have changed. And so has the way in which they resist, and the way in which things are done, both on the ground and what should be done outside. So I think a lot of what is being done currently is very institutionalized. We talk about Kashmir on certain days of the year. When there is an anniversary of something that happened on this date, we're going to talk about Kashmir, we're going to have a protest today, we're going to make sure that people remember, and remembrance is important. Remembrance is kind of the essence of our resistance. But other than that, we need to stop being reactionary. If we have to do new things, we need to generate things which aren't only done in response to things which India does in Indian-occupied Kashmir, or other events which occur out there. We need to do things which are continual, which gauge the attention of the media, which bring Kashmir back to the forefront of the international forums, where earlier you were saying that it's not even within the top 10, not in the US or in Delhi. And why is that? We have to raise these questions. And I think we have a long way to go with that, but that's kind of what I had to say about activism. And I don't claim to be any sort of activist. I think the day where we have something which is continual, which makes coherent sense, and which has some sort of aims and goals which we're able to achieve and show, look, we did this and it worked, there was an actual something which happened, then we can claim to be some sort of an activist. I'm going to read a poem which I wrote kind of very recently since Barina ji arrived, and I apologize if it's not very well polished, but it's kind of a dedication to Mughal Mas, who was the woman who you saw in the documentary which was played before Barina ji spoke. And it was wrote by myself and somebody called Muhammad Faisal from Srinagar. So this is for Mughal Mas. Slowly, he faded into the corner of a street where the grocer sold vegetables through the back door of a curfewed city, his face drawn in her memory for eternity and the last time. She waited that night, cradling the pillow where his head once rested, her hands shaped like hope, cradling a person, not yet memory, a voice, not yet echo, that would not fall but tear through the silence. Nights in the occupied land are brutal. Memories project in hearts of the men and women who lost their loved ones through separation or death or a promise that never came. Days of joy are unshackled by this grief, and they haunt her like a never-ending nightmare. There's no pause to regain your hold on the joy that once was, and no fast forward to another place where joy may someday live. There is only truth, and in its quest, life goes on. She kissed the stamped photo of his school identity card, not expired yet, but what was left now lingered somewhere between everything and nothing. She cradled his memory. It was now wrapped in the jails she searched, in the screams escaping torture camps, the smell of slaughterhouses, and the offices of the oppressors that reeked of deceit and blood-stained footprints of the bodies they had torn from this land. But she reached the Almighty, and hope sprung from shrines and the barren caves, and she gathered her broken soul. Wa inna ma al-usri yusra. Verily, with hardship there is ease. The night was nearing end, the dusk was near, the crescent moon lay hidden, and she was cloaked. The festering wound slowly ceasing to hurt, and her eyes lit up, as though she knew where he would be, and her quest at last would end. Months before, she told the gathering of butterflies in the park smudged with flowers of red to keep fighting and struggle until their cries and soft tears were redeemed with tranquility. Her mortality had left her empty. But now she would meet her child. She would cradle him forever, and there would be no street corner where his memory would fade. The sun rose that day. Clouds with hues of red rose over Zabarvan. The Jhelum heaved loudly as if tears had parched their banks, and the men took her on the shoulders, on the streets where she had once taken him on her shoulders. And they lay her to rest, a smile on her face. She had met him on her way, and there were no street corners where his memory would fade. His face drawn in her memory for eternity and the last time.
Our final speaker is Talat Bhat, who's an activist and documentary filmmaker and a trade unionist based in Lund, Sweden. He has a master's degree in media production and he researches on the impact of new media technologies in conflict zones. He's currently working on the documentary Bring Him Back, which deals with Shahid-e-Kashmir Maqbool Bhat's mother's struggle to have his remains returned to Kashmir. But I'll let Talat speak about that.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much, Goldie and Dibyesh, for organizing this marvelous event. Well, and I really like Anania's term, the Facebook Kashmir, because that's how I got to know Fahad 4 years ago and make this documentary possible. You know, I'm born in Pakistani side of Kashmir, based in Sweden, where I cannot go Indian side of Kashmir, but with the social networks, it got possible to connect with Fahad. And then we started, we're working the last 2.5 years on this documentary. And I will show you this 3 minutes promo, and then we can discuss more. So.
Tasmin Magbar Busha, Tasmin Magbar Prajai, Wikinas, Curly, Saras Multi Curly, Tragamas Multi Curly, Magbar Subanoyat. इसका अपना साथ क्यों इच्छास वैसे क्यों इच्छास पका प्राप्त की जाए नमस्कार खुदाया कैसा करूँ खुदाया से मांगने मैंने खुदाया का तुम काजत नहीं भार तो बाय से हाजिर का तुम भाई मुश्किल मैंने खुदाया का तुम मुश्किल भारी मुश्किल मैं घर से लोगों सबने मुझे बनाता सठा फकर 4 गुल गए में शहीद गोडक गो मकबूल साहब तम पत गो हबीबुल्लाह भट्ट तम पत गो गुलाम नबी भट्ट तम पत गो मंजूर अहमद भट्ट मैं सब मकसद बोलो एम की मैं लिखनी चीज सदरस ये ताश गो मकबूल साहब स्मूज तो मैं सच ताश नेर बाई बका तो मुझे सदरस लिखनी चीज Pakistan Hindustan siyasa gara torak agent gara no si torak agent no si yor no drama azadi bas is azadi sana is azadi sun bachto witness sana tasne balte sun balte sor ya Kashmir se sada azadi bas to drama
na tu no do kana la ki we azadi din sana gobra ho ruh roy de inshallah
मकसद सोन मकसद में यह है ऐसा गैस खसन डेली गसा ऐसा यह है वैसे यह मकबरस में करूँ दफन
So in this documentary, she's Maqbool Bhatt's mother. She's 84 years old, and telling the story of Maqbool Bhatt, and at the same time showing the Sufi traditions and secular traditions of Kashmir. And she's writing the letter to the President of India, and at the same time she's doing all sort of campaigns work to get, and also to explain the feelings what the mother think for the last 30 years she's waiting for. Well, that's then we can go for question and answer. Yeah.
Excellent. I think all throughout the day, and I think in this panel, the whole question of representation. And it's linked to azadi, to freedom. So freedom to have knowledge, freedom to produce knowledge, freedom to talk about these issues, freedom not to be able to post on Facebook and then be put in jail. I mean, all of these things, and the film that you're making is also about a kind of piecing together of history, of an older memory for a younger generation. And I think those are the kinds of links and connections that I saw between all of the talks.
I mean, of course, let me first thank everyone, because I tend to forget to thank most important people. Of course, this conference was possible, and I'll answer the last question made by gentlemen, what do we do after this? I mean, this conference was made possible because of, let's say, help from our university, our department, but also various centers from University of Warwick. So I have to thank especially Goldie for doing this initiative, work in Warwick as well as here. Thank you. Now, and of course, and thank the numerous volunteers here, including Greg, Ashish, and others. But let me tell you, I have organized many conferences on Tibet, China, India, even Kashmir partly. But this was the most difficult conference for me to organize. And one factor, I'll not go into many factors, right? Usual thing is that why invite this, why not invite that? Why invite only one-sided people? Why not invite, let's say, pro-India people? Or why so much focus on critiquing India but not critiquing Pakistan? And these are part and parcel of any conferences. We are not here to provide a universal perspective on any issue. It's a conversation. For us, this conference is part and parcel of a conversation that we hope will carry on. So this is not the only one, though, to be honest, it exhausts us to organize these things. And that's to do with various practical issues. But something I would like to mention was, and I mean, in a sense, for me, the person who encouraged me to not give up at very crucial time was Parveena Hangarji. She may not have realized it. Reason is, when we had organized it, when everything was well planned, her visa was rejected. Her visa was rejected by the British government. Now, and I'm not sure, the reason was simple. I'll tell you, the person who interviewed her said, yes, we have looked into all your documents, you do not have enough money and resources. Yes, you say you'll go to UK for a conference, and the conference organizers have confirmed that they have invited you, and they'll pay, well, they'll cover every cost, but we fear you do not have enough money, you do not have resources, and you may claim asylum. Now, Parveena ji, who has struggled for justice against Indian state for 24 years, so the visa officer there in Delhi makes a judgment just by looking at her bank account or having no bank account that she is not rich and therefore doesn't deserve to come to the UK. That was the rejection that was the reason for rejection of a visa. Thankfully, Foreign Office did help in the end, and a couple of MPs, their involvement, not fully, but some involvement did help, because one of the things I had to do was say, look, we'll have a public campaign to say that human rights campaigners, if they do not have money, should not expect to be invited to the UK or should not expect to get visa to the UK. But of course, human rights violators with money are always invited here. Now, why do I say this? Because this is a struggle. This is a struggle. There is an India struggle. Forget that. I mean, I'm sure people who work in British High Commission, we don't know who are involved in these things. But Parveena ji has faced that kind of struggle, and this is only 0.0001% of what she faces at everyday level. And I at one time said, why was I mad into trying to organize this? But when I spoke to her, she said, कि जब तक आप हैं वहाँ पर, आप अकेले हैं मेरे बेटे की तरह, कोई परेशानी नहीं है, सब ठीक हो जाएगा. So the fact that you are there as a son of mine, and I get as son of mine, and it should be okay. And that gave me strength when there was a lot of confusion, bureaucratic houses, negativity involved in doing this. To be honest, I feel very privileged to have her here, and of course other speakers too, but other speakers, they should, but have her here. And I mean, I'm not trivializing other speakers, but I mean, you all are there. But Parveena ji's presence here has electrified, I think, most of us in certain sense, made us emotional, and I think the first time my tears are coming in this university, and I've been here for 7 years, right? And I'm not an emotional person in that sense. Listening to her, listening to struggle, what I take from what she said is, look, I understand there's a lot of problems with British government and all governments, Indian governments, but she has not given up hope. She has not given up the struggle. And our role, as in whatever capacity, is to remind our governments, even when we don't like the government, remind our government, remind other governments that we will not give up. We should not give up. So a mother whose son has disappeared, I cannot say the lost word because we don't know, has disappeared, she has not given up fighting against one of the most brutal form of colonization in contemporary world. So how can we as scholars, as diaspora, as writers, give up? So on that note, I would like to thank Parveena ji again. Parveena ji, aap aaiye.